Hello, and welcome students of MACS 210, the history of mass communication, and the first of our series of video lectures to conclude this term of the course in lieu, unfortunately, of the opportunity to have face-to-face instruction because of the current state of affairs in the world. We will proceed with Lecture 10 and the remaining lectures in the course via video uploaded to the Blackboard LMS, where you've already accessed this. I just want to give everyone some instruction. The PowerPoint presentation that I would have presented in class as an accompaniment to this lecture has also been uploaded to the Blackboard LMS under the same weekly material at which you accessed this video link. And although I'll encourage you to use the PowerPoint presentation that's available, I will actually throughout this video lecture indicate verbally what it's appropriate to switch to the next slide. Also, however, I'll integrate images of the slides actually into this video as well. So you'll have both of those resources available to you. So our agenda for today, of course, would have been the presentation by group number 8, which is not available to us in this format, of course, but I will post their contributions to that assignment as they have been reassigned according to the announcements on Blackboard once I've received them after this week of absence in courses and had a chance to review it. And I'll post that, of course, to this same weekly material. And the other part of the course was to be the lecture on changing media landscapes through the late 20th century and into the 21st century, accompanied by a number of video clips. And as you probably have noticed already, I have actually included the links to many of the video clips that I was intending to show also in this, to the weekly material on the Blackboard LMS. Interestingly, in this lecture, unlike the last two to follow, I don't actually have much to add to the readings that were available to you, although many of them not assigned. And I'll really just be commenting, I think, in this lecture on the contents of this section of the textbook. Beginning with a statement made actually in another textbook, which indicates that from the 1964 publication of Marshall McLuhan's celebrated text, Understanding Media, all the way through to the early 1990s, discussions of the relationship of media to society are, of course, largely focused on television, because it was the dominant new medium of the period. And with that thought in mind, I'll invite you now to switch to the second slide, number 2, in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation uploaded to the Blackboard LMS. And note that as an addendum to that thought, indeed, in Lynn Spiegel's essay, Making Room for TV, chapter 31 of our textbook, she reports that in post-war years, the television set actually became a central figure in of representations of family relationships. The introduction of the machine into the home meant that family members needed to come to terms, actually, with the presence of a communication medium that might transform older modes of family interaction. Now, in her paper, Spiegel surveys contemporary magazines, actually, that maintained a tradition of representing, quote, ideal home layouts as part of their visual content. You can see 3 of them here in this PowerPoint slide. By the early 1940s, floor plans included a space for television in the home's structural layout. And television sets were increasingly depicted as everyday, commonplace objects that any family might hope to own, regardless of income or class. Indeed, the magazines that she surveys included television as a staple home fixture before most Americans could even receive a television signal. So while the technology was young in its broadcasting capabilities, much less consider purchasing the expensive items. And we talked about the ways that lower income families actually put a run on Wall Street with their borrowing in order to be able to purchase televisions in the earliest stages of their commercial distribution. Now, these media discourses didn't so much reflect the reality of the common household in terms of their placement of a television and the reorganization of especially the living room around the television. Instead, these images preceded it sort of as a magazine guide to the ways that families should be reorganizing the domestic space to accommodate the new media technology of the television. Spiegel actually points out that it was in this era that we saw the emergence of the term family room, quite common in the description of our households today, in this post-war period. And that it's the emergence of the term is, she calls it, a perfect example of the importance attached to organizing household spaces around ideals of family togetherness. Now, what Spiegel does not mention in her article are the layouts that actually did not include a depiction of the television. You can see from the images here taken from contemporary magazines that two of them, the ones on the left, certainly demonstrate the family organizing their social interactions around the television. But the third, from a two-page layout in a magazine, does not actually have the television in it. And yet, you can see from this image that even images in these magazines that did not have the television, they certainly seem to imply a television. This image, for example, appears very much to be from the perspective of the television, as though it was some sort of media big brother observing and perhaps validating the middle-class bourgeois family standard that these magazines were championing as something to which everybody should aspire. Now, in these years immediately following World War II, she points that when advertisers were in the midst of their reconversion campaigns, that is to say, channeling the country back from the wartime pressures of personal sacrifice and domestic upheaval to a peacetime economy based on consumerism and, of course, consumerism surrounding family values. The advertisements in these magazines suggested that television would serve as a catalyst for the return to a world of domestic love and affection, which we can see not only pictorialized, but even with some text to apply it, to supplement it. TV happiness shared by all the family in this image. These images of family love and affection really represented a world that must have been quite different from the actual experience of returning G and their new families in the chaotic years of readjustment to civilian life. The returning soldiers and their wives experienced an abrupt shift in social and cultural experiences, and horror stories of shell-shocked men circulated in psychiatric journals. In 1946, for example, social workers at VA hospitals counseled some 144,000 men. Half of them were treated for neuropsychiatric diseases. And even for those lucky enough to escape the scars of battle, popular media, such as filled the television screens, really also depicted in shows, for example, like The Twilight Zone, not just the consumer ideal and utopia, but really images of sexually unstable men, scarred psychologically, and unable to relate to the familiar ideals and bureaucratic realities of post-war life. And the message was clearly one transmitted by a culture industry catering to the middle-class suburban ideal, which was perhaps not available to as widespread a sector of the population as the images in these magazines would have liked to have suggested. And so at this point, I'll invite you to progress to slide number 3 in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation to this video lecture in our exploration of the changing landscapes of media through the late 20th century. And, while Spiegel describes in her article the changing landscape of the domestic space in the 1940s. In Gary Edgerton's From Turmoil to Tranquility, chapter 32 of our textbook, he describes the changing landscape of the popular imagination in the 1960s as a result of television's unparalleled reach to massive audiences. So, less than 3 months after the Kennedy assassination, the second and fourth, which was in 1963, the second and fourth most watched shows of the decade, on January 8th and 15th installments of the Beverly Hillbillies, attracted 72 and 70 million viewers, respectively. Interesting, the very hard political edginess that was present in the assassination of Kennedy sort of being offset by people's absolute fascination with this popular situation comedy. And these two examples, the January 8th and 15th of 1963 installments of the Beverly Hillbillies, according to Edgerton, personified the high-spirited escapist shtick common with most establishment TV as a counterpoint to such troubling political situations in the world that television was now bringing into the family living room as the Kennedy assassination. And I've posted a link to an interesting video review of the impact on society and some of the media images of the Kennedy assassination on the Blackboard LMS to this weekly section of the course. Now, in stark relief to the first and third highest rated programs of the 1960s, featured a different kind of entertainment altogether. On February 9th and February 16th, according to the reading, the Ed Sullivan Show presented the Beatles to a mass American television audience for the first time. John, Paul, George, and Ringo, according to the article, drew nearly 74 million viewers for their U.S. television premiere on February 9th. And a week later, 71 million Americans tuned to see what all the fuss was about. Now, it's interesting that what Edgerton does not mention, bewilderingly, is their even more popular appearance 1 week later. That is to say that there were actually 3 appearances, 3 weeks in a row on the Ed Sullivan Show of the Beatles. And again, I've posted a link to their performance and his introduction of their performance in this third week. It's a YouTube video link, again, to the weekly material for this contribution to the Blackboard LMS. And the Beatles and other countercultural entertainers offered their fans an irresistible alternative to the mostly well-worn traditions of establishment television. And the Ed Sullivan Show actually had been the only primetime venue to regularly host African-American talent. Throughout both the 1950s and the early 1960s. Literally dozens of black performers, as varied as Louis Armstrong, pictured here, Ella Fitzgerald, Nat King Cole, Eartha Kitt, also pictured here, Bo Diddley, and Fats Domino had frequently graced Sullivan's stage, along with many African-American athletes, such as Sugar Ray Robinson, Willie Mays, and Wilt Chamberlain, who often showed up to take bows, he says. These television phenomena certainly had their offspring. The Monkees television show was actually inspired by the Beatles' hit movie A Hard Day's Night from 1964. And of course, this television show was really just a knockoff of the Beatles. The Monkees used a similar array of surrealistic film techniques such as fast and slow motion, distorted focus, comic film inserts, one-liners, non-sequiturs, and all delivered at a very fast pace, which was really borrowed from the Beatles movie. Once again, what we would have viewed in class, I've posted a link to an episode of the Monkees television show, complete with its infamous opening musical introduction, and it gives, I think, a pretty good example of some of these surrealistic film techniques particularly the one-liners, non sequiturs, and sped up images, sped up video images for the sake of comedy. And again, that link is also posted to the Blackboard LMS weekly material for this week's lecture. And the article goes on to talk about such powerful television shows as Bonanza, which was the #1 series in the nation for 3 seasons, running between 1964 and 1967, as well as the Vietnam War, which was brought to television viewers in more negative graphic detail than any war in history had previously. New Yorker TV critic Michael Arlen christened the Vietnam War the Living Room War, because it was the first war brought to the people predominantly by television, and because the conventions of news reporting of war were not strictly established at this point, many of the images were far more violent and disturbing than we would be used to in terms of war news coverage today. And once again, I've posted a video to the weekly material on the Blackboard LMS for this week of the course, reviewing an example of a news broadcast bringing the Vietnam War into homes, the living rooms in the 1960s. Now, following those reviews of different television programs, Edgerton actually reserves most of his commentary for a review of the televised moon landing in 1969. He says that the moon landing was a global television event comprising live feeds, poll and footage provided by the news divisions of CBS, NBC, and ABC. More than anything, the moon landing functioned as the climactic episode, he says, and a kind of continuing mini-series of the ongoing telecast of the NASA expeditions to the moon, telecasting of the 6 Mercury missions, 1961 to 1963, and the 10 Gemini missions from 1965 to 1966, to the 7 Apollo missions between 1967 and 1969, before accommodating on July 20th of 1969, July 20th of 1969, that's the pivotal date, with Apollo 11's actual touchdown on the lunar Sea of Tranquility, approximately 240,000 miles away from our own planet Earth. So the core telecast actually took place over 30 continuous hours during July 20 and 21, when the much smaller lunar module, the Eagle, disengaged from Columbia and landed on the moon, carrying Mission Commander Neil Armstrong and Eagle pilot Buzz Aldrin. And once again, for this one, again, we would have looked at these in class. I've posted a very interesting link to a series of shorts of the extended many hours of video footage recorded of the moon landing, including the descent of the lunar module, the descent of Armstrong down the ladder of the lunar module once it had landed, and his acquisition of another camera, as well as the first moonwalk and his first comments. And so, interestingly enough, you should have a look at those. They're really quite fascinating. Again, just like when we looked at or listened to, for example, the radio broadcast of War of the Worlds, perhaps not very compelling by modern standards, but certainly in its day, it was one of the most fascinating things, and acquired the largest audiences television had ever known. And in fact, I can't help but throwing into the lecture an unabashed plug of one of my favorite TV shows. There's actually a really good episode of The Crown, the TV series The Crown, available on Netflix. The Crown is actually largely about the very whitewashed colonial imperial life and times of a young Queen Elizabeth II. But in season 3, episode 7, entitled Moon Dust, there's an interesting, the narrative of this episode is such that it captures how even the most aristocratic elite in society were taken to watching this television broadcast. In fact, an estimated worldwide television viewership of 528 million people watched the moon landing, the largest audience for any TV program ever in history up to that point. The accompanying radio listenership, relevant to us in terms of the history we've looked at, increased the aggregate total to nearly 1 billion, providing a broadcast audience at that point in history of about 1/4 of Earth's entire population. An unparalleled and unsurpassed moment in broadcasting history. And so now at this point, I'll invite you to switch to slide number 4 in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation as we continue our discussion today in today's lecture of the changing landscapes of media in the late 20th century. Unsurprisingly, from the effects on the bourgeois family outlined by Spiegel in The Domestic Space to the unprecedented explosion in audience sizes characterized most poignantly by the viewership of the moon landing, of course, the phenomenon of television caused some social anxiety. And in Richard Butch's article called Boob Tubes, Fans and Addicts, chapter 33 of our textbook, he surveys some of the more alarmist reactions to this new social media entity. And he points out early in his article that the characterization of audiences during the 50s in particular was as a public health problem, and that addictive viewership was even seen as medically pathological. He explains that the media addict, usually an individual, usually male, isolating himself from relationships with family and friends and community, and for not filling his responsibilities to the family, the community, and the polity, and for failing to cultivate himself. And of course, this image would carry over with the introduction of the internet, especially with the introduction of home video game systems and then online gaming to the addicted gamer. A very little distinction can be made between these representations of the addicted television viewer and the contemporary alarm surrounding people who make extensive use of video games. And there was a widespread characterization of audience pathology that appeared in newspapers, magazines, even in movies, as well as, ironically, on television and in radio. And the diagnosis of heavy viewing was attributed to character, to personal character, rather than to external limitations, and it provided the foundation for a pathological characterization of the addicted viewer. By the mid-1950s, cartoon characters represented a wider range of classes than just the lower classes onto which addiction had been displaced. But the butt of the humor was frequently heavy viewers, and these were usually men who were more wedded to the television than to their wives or children, often watching particularly sports. And while these cartoons seem to represent heavy viewing as cutting across the classes, researchers more frequently associated heavy viewing with lower classes. Heavy viewing was linked to indiscriminate viewing and the lack of parental supervision of particularly children's viewing. And this would become known as a syndrome called passive viewing. And it was also particularly identified as a pattern of use specifically common to the lower classes. Probably the single most important early study was called Television in the Lives of Children by now historically celebrated media scholar Wilbur Schramm in concert with his graduate students at Stanford. They concluded that the working class man felt personal problems are too big for him to solve and sought relaxation and escape, while the middle class man faced a challenge and tried to solve his own problems. And finally, they claimed that middle-class children grew into what they labeled the mature television use pattern. And so the distinction here is that mature television use is of deferred gratification, while working-class children were not able to do that. And they labeled this the principle of maturation, implying that working-class adults were immature in comparison to their more sophisticated middle class or upper class television viewers. And really, however, as time moved on into the late 50s, the main focus of public discourse was on protecting innocent children from the ill effects of television. Parents Magazine, for example, warned parents to limit the hours of their children's viewing, supervise what they see, plan their viewing week, and discourage programs that upset children. And most importantly, not to use television as a not to use television as a babysitter, but to watch television with their children and explain from a responsible middle-class point of view what the children were seeing. And so linking overuse of television to less education even, not just lower classes, but particularly the function of lower classes of having lesser education, medical professionals actually blamed lower class parents for irresponsible behavior in their own and their children's use of television. And for the delinquency that claimed to result, these medical professionals claimed was the result of irresponsible television use. And finally, however, in the 1960s, moving away from addiction and irresponsible lower class use of television, especially in irresponsible lower class management of children's exposure to television. In the 1960s, researchers began to focus more on the effects of television violence than on television overuse. And there was an entire spate of research done at that time, sponsored by particularly the American government, which concluded ultimately that extensive exposure to television violence actually does create more violent impulses in the individual viewer. And there was one humorous conclusion that said, while it's contradicted by the hyper-defensive media industry, there's more evidence to support the effects of violence behavior from violent television viewing than there is to support the effectiveness of birth control. I don't know why that was the comparison, but it was amongst the comparisons made. And so at this point in the video lecture that we're enjoying, I'll invite you to proceed now to slide 5 in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation, the last slide in the PowerPoint presentation, in order to review the last selection that I'd like to discuss today by Bolter and Grusin, called The World Wide Web, which is, of course, chapter 36 of our textbook. And of course, according to Bolter and Grusin, they claim that the web today, the World Wide Web today, is eclectic and inclusive and continues to borrow from and remediate, as they call it, almost any visual and verbal medium that we can name. According to them, the liveliness of the web is a refashioned version of the liveliness of broadcast television, of which we've been looking at quite extensively throughout the previous moments in this particular lecture. According to Bolter and Grusin, prior to the World Wide Web, the services of the internet, such as email and simple file transfer, refashioned principally alphabetic media, the book, the letter, or the technical report. However, as a remediation to that, a celebrated internet pioneer named Tim Berners-Lee, he proposed the World Wide Web hypertext service, so that scientists could actually more readily share their papers and numerical data. However, in 1993, Mark Andreessen and colleagues at the University of Illinois created the first graphical browser, the forerunner to Netscape, which permitted static images to appear along with text on the page. So these were not moving images, these were static images, like the images you see here in these PowerPoint slides, but it was a change from only text to image-based World Wide Web sites. This apparently minor addition, according to the reading, had two momentous consequences. First, the web began to engage a much larger audience of users. And the second consequence, related to this first consequence of larger audiences, was that the World Wide Web could now refashion a much larger class of earlier media, not just text-based media. In addition to the letter and the scientific report, it could now remediate the magazine, the newspaper, and graphic advertising. And at this point, internet magazines and news services became popular and important genres on the World Wide Web. And the tradition to which web designers now looked for inspiration was graphic design for print, and the principles of web page design became similar to those for laying out magazine articles, advertisements, and title pages. Traditional graphic design, according to the article, could not account for moving images. So the internet and the World Wide Web necessarily passed into a new phase when they began to deliver animation, fuller interactivity, and of course digital video and audio, digital being the key there. And I'll talk more about that in next week's lecture on digitalization. It's interesting, they make an interesting connection to the previous reading, the Edgerton reading, when they claim that the CD-ROM or DVD encyclopedias, they promised a new transparency through animation, video, and audio that could not appear in printed versions. That is to say, these new World Wide Web versions of encyclopedias had video accompaniment to what they were describing, right? The user, according to the article, the user could hear Martin Luther King's voice for the choir, or the choir for particular exotic birds. The viewer can see digitized video of a volcanic eruption, or, interestingly, the first landing on the moon. And it goes on to talk about how some of the earlier videos that populated the World Wide Web were quite banal in nature, trained on some corner of the world. He gives the example of a hamster in a cage, a coffee machine, or the traffic on an expressway. Web cameras took up the monitoring function of television and video that had been done really through, you're talking about surveillance function. It was largely a surveillance function. The web and related services on the internet then began to supplement and even rival broadcast television in its role. So at first it was just surveillance video that was quite boring, but then the sort of journalism function of surveying the social environment, which was more topical and more presented, began to be superseded by video on the internet. In 1997, when the Mars Pathfinder, pictured here, became the first spacecraft to land on another planet after the first one after the widespread deployment of the web. The site operated by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory became the world's most distant and exotic web camera. But yet there was still some relatively banal stuff. The guinea pig television site, for example, playfully acknowledging the web's remediation of television, put trained a camera on the site operator's guinea pig cage for hours at a time, and allowed the animals to view the inside graphic frame of a television set. That is to say, it was framed graphically in a television set in order to sort of poke fun at the way the internet, or the World Wide Web, was replacing television in this fashion. So in conclusion to this first of our video series, ending the last few lectures of our course in the history of mass communication, I'd just like to point out how cumulatively these changing landscape ideas that I've presented to you and that are presented in the readings in this portion of the textbook really foreground the demassification theme. How when one media impinges on the traditional territory of another media, we see the media having to move into smaller and more fragmented media audiences in order to sustain advertising dollars and even social relevance to maintain the media. You know, the big example is when television really took over a lot of the programming, the syndicated national programming of radio, and radio demassified from a national advent to much more local urban presentations of recorded music rather than the syndicated television shows like Blondie that we listened to a sample of that then migrated to TV. And of course, the same happened with the introduction of the World Wide Web, or at least the popularization of the World Wide Web, when many of the traditional television viewing formats migrated to the internet through streaming and other YouTube type services. And television has had to demassify in many ways, although that's an evolving history that we will eagerly keep our eyes on to see what becomes of traditional television as the 21st century moves on. And overall, a previous section of our reading points out that this illustrates a recurring theme in the history of communications, the way a new medium often tries to do what was already the preserve of an earlier one, but in ways that bypass some of the problems and complexities of its predecessor. And in the introduction to this final section of the textbook, it reiterates this notion of bypass and says new media frequently bypass difficulties, bottlenecks, or barriers encountered in older media, and this has come, as they point out, to be referred to as the bypass effect, or bypass technology, which we've seen again and again through history, absorbing and reformulating, or as Bolter and Grusin say, remediating previous forms of mass communication. And on that note, I'll bring this first in our video lecture series to a close. And I'll invite everyone to ensure that they stay safe in these strange times. But most importantly, I'd like to remind you to please have a look at the video links that are also attached to the weekly material for this week video, the moon landing, etc., the assassination of Kennedy, because it's important to, I think, complement this video discussion with the actual video samples demonstrating the ideas that I've tried to foreground and articulate in this video lecture. And as would have been the case if I presented those videos in class, it's possible that some of the material in those videos may be present amongst the multiple choice questions you'll encounter for the final quiz. So please take the time to have a look at those. And otherwise, once again, take care of yourselves, and I'll look forward to continuing with this video lecture series next week as we proceed through the end of MACS 210, the history of mass communication.